So what we're showing you here is a freeze frame of a ventilator that we use at ZSFG. It's the Covidian ventilator, Puritan-Bennett ventilator. And just to sort of frame to you what elements of the screen you'll be looking at that match up with the modes and the prescribed modes that you're setting. So if you look at the bottom frame here, bottom of the frame, this is the area of what is set on the ventilator. These are the numbers that the respiratory therapist punches into the ventilator. This portion of the slide, the top portion, that is what is measured on the ventilator. Okay, and then finally you have the graphs here to look at. Okay, so if we focus on what is prescribed, what you write in, what are the settings of the mode of the ventilator, you can see here that we're in assist control volume, VC assist control, VC is volume control. You can see that the therapist has entered the weight of the patient, and the tidal volume that's been prescribed is also given to you in terms of milliliters per kilo, which will be important when we talk about ARDS later on. Here you can see the set rate, the set frequency, right, of 14, set tidal volume of 550, the FiO2 of 21 in this particular case, and the PEEP of 5. Also, you'll notice the respiratory therapist has set the maximal flow rate at 55 liters per minute. Now let me show you what some of these numbers look like on the graph themselves. So the first thing you'll see is we want you to focus on the pressure waveform here. Okay? And roughly this yellow line, the flat portion of it, is your PEEP. It is your set PEEP down here. Okay? When you want to figure out what your peak pressure is, that equates to the peak here of this pressure waveform. And that measurement, it's not something you dial in as a setting on the ventilator, but that measurement is also expressed numerically here in the upper left-hand corner. The plateau pressure is this shoulder of the pressure waveform here. And that number is expressed numerically here. These are both measurements that are made by the ventilator, and that's why they're expressed up here in the top bar, as opposed to a setting, which would be expressed down here in the lower bar. The next graph I want you to look at is the volume or the flow waveform here. And that equates to this sort of number here of 55. Here we're using a square waveform, so you can see that the waveform of the flow is square, right? There are some modes of ventilation where you can have a decelerating waveform, which would look sort of more like this, okay, decelerating, okay? But for the most part, we set them up with a square waveform. And you can see that the peak of that square wave is 55. Now remember, this is the rate at which the volume will be going into the patient to achieve the volume that you've set, okay? And then finally, the last waveform you'll see is the volume waveform here. And again, since we're in assist control volume, this is the same every single breath is the same volume. They all peak out at 550. So let's go back to the COPD patient. You put the patient on volume control at a rate of 16 and a tidal volume of 600. Which one statement is true of the tidal volume delivered if the measured rate is 22? So the correct answer here is A. Every breath will be 600 ml per breath, whether it's the set rate of 16 or the additional 6 breaths that the patient is taking. Now this is a product of the mode that you're in, which is volume control, assist control. So every breath in that mode is the same exact breath, whether the patient wants a big breath or a small breath. And we'll talk a little bit about the differences now. So this table sort of highlights or at least summarizes for you the 3 most important modes of ventilation that we use in the intensive care unit. Every other fancy mode that you hear about in the ICU will be a spin-off of one of these modes. So if you really understand one of these 3 modes, you'll be able to think about, derive, and figure out all the other modes that are out there with just a little bit more information. So the first one we want to highlight here is volume control. Here at ZSFG and actually within the UC system as a whole, volume control is our go-to mode, especially for when we initially place people on the ventilator. So what you'll see here is that in comparing the volume, right, the volume of every breath in volume control will be exactly the same. The pressure that's measured on the ventilator itself will depend on lung compliance. So if the lung is very stiff, the volume that you prescribe will will equate to a very high plateau pressure. If the compliance improves such that the lung is more compliant, the same volume that you deliver will actually equal a lower pressure. And following the plateau pressure is actually a useful thing sometimes when you're diuresing the patient or when you're trying to see if their ARDS is improving, that kind of thing. The rate in volume control is set. They will get the minimum rate that you prescribe, but the patient can trigger a rate above that at whatever they prefer, whatever their physiology or dictates. The flow rate, again, is the same for every single breath in volume control. And this is the key feature of volume control in comparison to the others. We set a constant flow rate throughout the inspiratory time for the volume that you're giving. And we'll show the other ones in a second. So the waveforms, if you think about the waveforms that we care about most on the ventilator when someone is in volume control, it's the ones that are going to change breath to breath. So namely, we're looking at the pressure time waveform. It's very important there. And the pressure volume loop. But for the most part, we're looking at the pressure time waveform. That's the top waveform that you see on the slide before, and we'll show in subsequent slides as well. If we look at pressure control, this is a mode that we will use from time to time when the patients cannot tolerate volume control for whatever reason. We'll use this one, but we don't use it as much, but it's important to know that it exists and how to use it. The volume in pressure control will depend on the patient's effort and the lung compliance. So if you contrast that to volume control, where the pressure depended on lung compliance, here the volume in pressure control will, the amount of volume that they get in the tidal volume will depend on the effort and the lung compliance of the patient itself. We give a set pressure, and that's the same every single breath, but if the patient wants to augment that pressure, they can pull harder and they can get a larger volume than you might normally achieve with a volume control. So sometimes patients will be giving efforts in pressure control that will equate to really large volumes, and that may not be what you want to do, depending on the clinical situation. The rate is very similar to volume control. It's as a set minimum rate, but the patient can breathe and trigger the ventilator spontaneously above that. But the key is they'll get the same pressure cycled breath, every single time. So because of that, when you put those three things together, you can see that the minute ventilation, or at least the tidal volume, can change breath to breath. And subsequently, the minute ventilation can change breath to breath. So if you're focusing on ventilation or CO2, pressure control might not be the most reliable way to ensure the patient gets a set minute ventilation that you think they need. The flow rate in pressure control depends on the patient's effort and lung compliance again. So they can set their own flow rate, which is why it's so much more comfortable than volume control. They can take a huge tidal volume, and they do that by achieving a much higher flow rate, which when you think about it is the way that we breathe normally when we're breathing at negative pressure ventilation. When we're going out and running or running up the stairs or running a marathon or whatnot, we can augment the effort that we give per each breath. We can set it. We do it based on our own needs and what we want. You can do that in pressure control, which is why some people think, and it's borne out when you look at the patient, pressure modes are a more comfortable mode to breathe on. But again, that may not be what you're trying to achieve, such as in the case of ARDS. Potentially you want a lower tidal volume, and you don't want to allow the patient to breathe huge, big tidal volumes in that particular case. So because of that, in pressure control, the waveform you care about most is the volume time waveform. So what is the tidal volume per breath, and what is the flow rate per each breath? Those are the two graphs that are going to change with time in these modes. Finally, pressure support. This is primarily a weaning mode of ventilation, and we use it quite a bit when we're weaning patients from the mechanical ventilator. Here, the volume will depend completely on the patient's efforts and the lung compliance. Big effort will equal big volumes. Little effort will equal little volumes. The pressure they get is the same, and in that sense, it's very similar to pressure control, but the way the pressure is delivered is slightly different for reasons we don't need to get into right now. The rate is completely spontaneous. You don't set a rate, the patient sets their own rate. They determine how fast or how slow to breathe. It's totally up to them. If they become apneic on this mode and they stop breathing entirely, the ventilator is set up with a backup mode and will switch to a volume cycled mode to protect the patient in the case of prolonged apnea. Flow rates, again, are dependent purely on the patient's efforts and lung compliance. And finally, the waveform you care most about in this mode because you're weaning is the volume. What is the volume they're getting per breath, and are they able to maintain that consistently throughout the entire spontaneous breathing trial? So here are the graphical representations of what you're going to see on the ventilator depending on the mode. So again, if we're going to focus on the lower left-hand corner, you know what mode you're in, right? But once you get really good, I should be able to completely cover up the bottom portion here, and you should be able to tell me what mode you are in on the ventilator. But just to highlight a couple things. So we're on assist control here. You notice you have a nice peak here, right? Very stylized drawing there, right? We've got peak and plateau just like before. We have a set flow rate and a set volume. Okay? This is very similar to the slide I showed before when I annotated or described the anatomy, if you will, of the screen itself. Here's an example of pressure control. And again, we know we're in pressure control because we're down here, PC, right? But here you already see a difference in what the waveform looks like. We have if we're looking at the pressure waveform here, we have what looks to be more of a square pressure form here, in the sense that the ventilator delivers a pressure, gets ramped up to pressure, holds that pressure for a complete I time, which here is listed as 0.9 seconds. So it holds it there for 0.9 seconds. Then the flow is stopped, and the pressure is allowed to come back to the baseline PEEP that you set here. There's your baseline PEEP. Then the next breath looks exactly like the one before it. So you get the same breath looking just like the one before it. And contrast that to the volume or the flow waveform. What you see here is that you see a waveform that is not square like you saw with the volume control mode. It's a more sort of gradual increase and a flattening out, gradual increase and flattening out or decreasing a little bit throughout the life of the breath itself. And then again, is the same here every single time. Now this, we're assuming that the patient is paralyzed and not giving any efforts whatsoever. And then finally you have the volume here as well. And in this representation, because it's a patient who we're assuming is paralyzed and not providing any efforts, the volume is the same every breath. And we'll show you later on some examples where the volume is not the same every breath. Then finally moving on to the spontaneous mode, and this is what we would consider a spontaneous breathing trial. This is pressure support. You can tell again you're in a spontaneous mode, fully spontaneous mode here, and you're in pressure support there. Okay, so we've set the FiO2 and the PEEP here, but we haven't set a rate, and all we've done is set a pressure support above the PEEP. So in total, what the patient will get is, if this is the PEEP, they'll get an additional delta 7 to achieve this peak right here. Okay, so in total, they get 12 centimeters of water of pressure per breath. That's what they get. The flow is very similar to, as you can see here, the flow is very similar to pressure control. And the volume, again, because we're assuming this is a patient that's not providing any additional efforts, the volume is the same. Right? But the important thing here to know, the difference between spontaneous breathing on this SBT with pressure support and pressure control is down here. Okay, the spontaneous and the PS. That's where you're going to see the biggest difference. So that's a brief introduction to the modes of ventilation. We'll get into more specifics in terms of different medical conditions later, and we'll also include some clips for you to look at and answer some questions based on those.